That's, I mean, I guess not really all that surprising, given what they're going to be doing. All right. So who's got, David, are you doing? Okay. All right, please turn to number 420. Number 420. O thou fount of every blessing. Number 420. O thou fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for song praise. Teach me ever to adore thee. May I still thy goodness prove, while the hope of endless glory fills my heart with joy and love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus saw me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Never let me wander from thee. Never leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. Okay, for other announcements, Linda did have her second infusion for this round this morning. So she's online with us, but she's just home tired from all of that. And my dad's continuing to do well. He actually had a doctor's appointment yesterday afternoon with his primary care, and they seemed pretty happy about how things are progressing. Not exactly happy at what happened, but he has his follow-up with the surgeon next week to kind of check on how things are healing and progressing. So prayers appreciated. Are there any other announcements or prayer requests?
Rebecca's brother David, and then again Gary has surgery when, Rebecca? 21st.
Okay. Want to keep David Williamson in our prayers and all that he's going through, and then Gary has a surgery on the 21st. If you didn't hear that. Okay, and what's his name? Brandon. Okay, Amia's brother Brandon could use some prayers, and God knows what that need is. So, Bubba's surgery is tomorrow.
We'll be traveling tomorrow.
Okay. So, Okay. Thorpes will be gone, but they'll be back ideally for Sunday. Okay. Just so we know whether to expect you or not.
We're leaving Saturday, and we'll see you toward the end of April.
Oh, okay. And the Woods are taking off for a more extended trip. So good for you guys. All right. All right. Let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer before we dive into our study this evening. Our Lord and our Father, we are ever so grateful for this opportunity to gather in your name and to study from your word, and we pray your blessing upon this time together, that we would let your word teach us, and that we would do our best to take this information and not only apply it to our lives first and foremost, but also help others to see these truths and to use them in their lives as well. Lord, we are mindful of all of those who were mentioned this evening, and who are on our prayer list, and those who are maybe not on the prayer list officially, Father, but are on our hearts and minds. And you know their needs better than anyone, and we ask that you look down upon them and your hand of comfort be upon them. And Lord, that even if they're struggling with health problems or other problems of this life, Father, that you might lift up their spirit, and that you could use us as ministering spirits to them as well. Please, Father, in His name, amen. All right, so we're talking about Jacob and Laban and all that's going on there. And so as we talked about on Sunday evening, we looked at chapter 30 of the book of Genesis, and the birth of Jacob's sons, or at least 11 of the 12, because Benjamin comes later. Again, there's a lot going on with this family, and I believe that God is utilizing all of this to turn Jacob into the man that he needs to be in order to earn that title, essentially, of Israel. And God helps. I think it's important. I think too often people have the mistaken idea that God only uses negative reinforcement. That is, I think, think about how many references there are in the media, especially, to things like fire and brimstone preaching. Do you know when the heyday of fire and brimstone preaching was?
1960? At the beginning of the Restoration.
The late 1700s and early 1800s. That was the heyday of fire and brimstone preaching. It's been 200 years, and people are still making references on TV and movies to fire and brimstone preaching. That's not a good image of God, because that's not the image he gives himself. Now, he is a just God, and he is a wrath at times, but the biggest thing that fire and brimstone preaching doesn't show is that negative reinforcement is actually like this much of what God uses to convince people to do what they need to do. The vast majority of what God uses is positive reinforcement. For example, sending Jesus to die for sinners. If God was all about negative reinforcement, you don't send Jesus. You let us suffer the consequences of our actions. We see that here at the end of chapter 30 as well, as Jacob becomes very prosperous. God is with him. And in fact, he's so prosperous that his father-in-law, and others take notice, not unlike what we saw with Abraham and with Isaac, where they're so prosperous that it benefits those that are just even connected to them, right? Abimelech wanted to sign treaties with both Abraham and Isaac because just having Abraham and his family living in the area was helping Abimelech's kingdom. And so again, God is using that same thing here at the close of chapter 30 as Jacob is continuing to prosper. Unfortunately, that prosperity in this case also becomes a two-edged sword. Because when Jacob has completed his time of service, he goes to his father-in-law Laban, his uncle, and this verse 25 tells us that this is about the time of Joseph's birth. Okay, and he says, "Send me away that I can go to my own place in my own country." And this is an interesting addition in verse 26. "Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me depart. For you yourself know my service which I have rendered to you." Oh, they're his wives. They're his children. They've gone through some sort of at least accepted legal process, right? By the way, we also need to understand that the whole marriage license, marriage contract thing, while it's very commonplace to us, super not common historically, very recent addition, and still not even necessarily the norm in large portions of the world to have to file a piece of paper with the government. Okay, so again, to feel like there's a little bit of a hostage situation going on here. Like he almost knows that he's going to have to fight to get his wives and children out of this situation. Look at verse 27. Can somebody read verses 27? Let's go 27 through 30 of chapter 30.
But Laban said to him, "If now it pleases you, stay with me. I have to bind as blessed me on your." He continued, "Name me what your wage is, and I will give it." But he said to him, "You yourself know how I have served you and how your cattle have fared with me. For you have little before I came, and it has increased to a multitude. And the Lord has blessed you wherever I turn. But now when shall I provide for my own household also?"
All right, so again, Laban realized that Jacob being around, not only was God blessing Jacob, but Laban's getting rich. Or richer. But by the way, this is the distinction here, right? Realistically, Isaac's, at least from the biblical account, hasn't told us that Isaac has passed away, right? But we already know that God's made Isaac a very wealthy man, and how many firstborns or how many people get to inherit that, since Esau's pretty much done nothing but spurn everything to do with his mother and father. Who's going to inherit everything, basically? Jacob. So by extension, Jacob is a wealthy man whether he gets anything or nothing from Laban, right? But again, God is blessing him, and Laban likes that he's being blessed by association. And so even though the original term of their contract, agreement, whatever term you want to put on it, is over, Laban's begging him, stay longer.
Don't blame him.
But there's a distinction here. None of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob ever cheated anyone to gain their wealth.
Well, Jacob.
Well, he technically hasn't gotten the wealth yet, and you could even make the argument that God said ahead of time he was going to get the wealth, even before his birth. But nothing that has been said here about, for example, the 14 years that Jacob has served has been underhanded, right? But it's just God blessing him. What I'm trying to get to here, and I'm sorry, I'm very tired and very distracted right now. what he's trying to get to here is that, or what I'm trying to get to is, this is kind of a picture of the difference of having wealth and desiring wealth. Right? We've talked about this before, that the Bible condemns the love of money, not money itself. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, wealthy men blessed by God, but they didn't strive for it, especially at the expense of others, right? And we even have examples. For example, Abraham letting Lot choose the better fields, right, when they had to depart from one another, and things of that nature, and I giving gifts, and or Isaac not starting a mini war over the wells, but just moving to another spot and digging another one, and then moving to another spot and digging another one, right? Realistically, he was giving up a lot of time and energy, even though, he wasn't the only one probably doing the digging, but again, until they find their place and until they find their and things. And yet here's Laban trying to grab for more. And that's the difference, right? The idea of having a love of money is everything that they agreed on. Jacob, in this interaction, again, Jacob's not innocent of all wrongdoing, but in this interaction between himself and Laban, who's been wronged every time? Jacob. And yet, even here, he's willing to take more, right? He's like, well, okay, fine. What's the cost this time? And so he does agree, and in verse 31, Laban kind of, now he acknowledges that maybe, okay, wait, I gotta kind of come back on the back end of this. Well, what do you want for more service, right? Because what did he serve for already? His wives, right? And so Laban realizes, oh, well, I can't just try to force him here. I can't just, essentially he is holding the family hostage for labor, but he offers to pay Jacob more, right? And Jacob's response is, I'm not going to take anything from you, but this is where he makes the agreement about the spotted and the speckled. In other words, the non-preferred, the imperfect animals he would take. And it's interesting here because, of course, he comes with this system, and it's not really clear exactly how this worked, whether it was God telling him this is what to do and I'll make sure the lambs are born speckled and spotted or striped or what have you, or if it was just Jacob coming up with this and then kind of like, hey, God, will you help me out? Because, of course, there's nothing about taking poplar and almond woods and making an X in front of animals that in any way affects genetics, right? If it was that easy, well, I don't know how many of you follow techie types, but do you know that there's a company that is trying to bring back woolly mammoths and has brought back dire wolves? There are three dire wolves that are, I think, 6 months old or something. Dire wolves are a pure white, larger variety of wolf. In fact, these three cub or pups, whatever they're called, at only about 6 months old, are actually now already larger than your average gray wolf, and they're not even fully grown.
Yeah, I knew they were trying to bring back the woolly mammoth, but I didn't know how close they are to
Yeah,
it.
they have woolly mice. They spliced woolly mammoth DNA onto mice and made very long-haired mice. So again,
About the kind of, I'd say another trickery thing.
Yeah.
Of putting the bark on them to make them look like the striped or speckled animals. Wasn't that what he did?
no, he just took these branches and set them before the animals.
Oh, I thought he
during
kind of camouflaged them so that the other ones would not, wouldn't know.
No, it was it
All right.
where they went to water. These were laying there, and then the females would bring forth when they lambed. I guess I assume
But he
that
only did that with the strong.
he only does that to the strong ones. Yeah, he's still picky, right? But again, if selective breeding and genetics were this easy, and without God's help, well, these companies wouldn't have reason to try to raise billions of dollars, right? They'd just get some sticks. So obviously God is involved in this, right? And so, Jacob is getting his wage, and of course, Laban thinking he's getting quite. And don't get me wrong, even though Jacob is choosing the stronger animals, is he preventing the weaker animals from breeding? No. So Laban is still increasing in his flocks and things. He's still being blessed because. But verse 43 tells us, so the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. Now, seemingly the servants and the other animals would come from continued sales of his animals, because, if you're not necessarily concerned about if the coat is perfect, it doesn't take much if one goat is considerably larger and healthier looking than another. You probably are going to be willing to pay for that one, regardless of what color the coat is, right? So again, God makes him very prosperous, and again, this is, I believe, all part of God's plan to bring Jacob along, to make him the man that he needs to be, by showing him, this is what following me gets you. You get blessed. Now, this isn't to say that we're all going to be insanely rich because we follow God, okay? I'm not trying to say that. In the same way that, for example, Jesus' instruction to the rich young ruler is not applicable to everybody. It was only for the rich young ruler that he said to take a vow of poverty. He doesn't expect us to take vows of poverty. He does promise to bless us to where we always have more than enough to give, however. So again, God is making him prosperous, and it all, to me, goes back to trying to help Jacob to see the path that he should choose. And I think it's also part of why when we keep getting some of these little peaks, for example, at Esau. For example, when Jacob was sent away to find his wife, Esau went and married another Canaanite, right? Two. Ishmael, yeah. I think at this point they're considered Canaanites, but yeah. Or one or two more Canaanites, or Ishmaelites. Got me all backwards. But he goes out and he marries more of the people that his father and mother don't. And the text tells us that it's basically just to cause them more grief, because he already saw the grief that came from the first two marriages. And so again, God is painting this picture, and we're going to see Esau, I think, have a slight redemptive arc, okay, when they meet back up, don't get me wrong. But we could also look at the history of the nations, right? The Edomites and the Israelites. And even though the brothers reconcile, the families never do. And that says a lot about the damage that's done during, the time that we're studying right now. Because again, this is the time when Esau, had he had the chance, would have killed Jacob. And so again, his family seeing this, and it sets the stage that lasts literally hundreds of years and generations upon generations of Edomites hate Israel and seem to to do almost nothing but try to harm the nation and the people of Israel. In fact, that's one of the things that's levied against them in the prophets, is that they were often, if not the ones causing the problem, they were kind of a secondary plague. Where, for example, when Israel was maybe besieged by the Philistines or the Assyrians or something, in the aftermath, the Edomites were coming in and looting houses. The Edomites were turning prisoners of war over to be punished and killed. So again, this is, kind of this different pathway. And sometimes I think sometimes not only can we do damage that we don't realize, I think we can also set an example that maybe has a stronger influence than we maybe think. Right? And I think that one's important to keep in mind, because, going back to this, how many of you can read the minds of anybody around you? Okay, cool. Just making sure. Right? So we don't know, right? We never know what our children are thinking about the example that we're setting, unless we ask them, and even then, it's often going to be a guarded answer, isn't it? We never know what influence we're having on our coworkers or our classmates or neighbors, right? We never really know, at least not the full extent, right? Maybe the neighbors all know us as they'll bend over backwards, give you the shirt off their back. They're great, good people, right? Good people. Maybe they know that. Maybe they'll even say some of that out loud to other neighbors and things, but they may never tell you the influence that you have, or the encouragement maybe that we give people to be good people themselves, right? And so again, what ends up being about 20 years, by the way. So he serves the 14 for his wives and children, then he serves an additional 6. So he essentially spends 20 years serving, 20 years away from his brother. And that's enough time to set the course of 2 nations for thousands of years. All right. So then, at the end of, or at the beginning of chapter 31, Laban's sons, his brothers-in-law, are complaining about what Jacob has done. Because again, even though they're spotted, they're speckled, they're ringed or whatever, they can look at it and say, that is a much healthier goat than what Dad's got. Right? That's a way bigger sheep than what we've got. And so they're complaining that this man has stolen their father's wealth. But not really, right? Because none of that would have happened if Laban had added or had kept to his original agreement, right? He did ask him to stay. But Jacob not only hears this, but according to chapter 31 and verse 2, Jacob senses a change in his father-in-law's attitude. He's not necessarily outwardly being attacking or anything like that, but something's changed, and Jacob kind of senses that it's not for his good, right? At least not personally. Because again, remember, this is in this society, if Jacob was to, let's say, fall down a well and tragically die, you know what would happen to those wives, those children, his flocks? They go back to their father-in-law, to his father-in-law. The wives go back to their father's house. So Jacob kind of sees what's going on, and I think makes the right choice here we got to leave, like now, right? So kind of under the cover of darkness, he goes, now that being said, can somebody read verses 3 through... Well, let's just go 3 through 9 for now. First of chapter 31.
Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." So Jacob sent word to Rachel to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, "I see that your father's attitude towards me is not what it was before. But the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have worked for your father with all my strength. Yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said, 'The speckled ones will be your wages,' then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, 'The streaked ones will be your wages,' then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock, and he has given them to you."
So again, God, we need to see here that it's not just Jacob saying, okay, we got to go. God tells him, you got to go. It's time. And we're going to see also that Laban is also going to get a message from God a little bit later. So, the Lord speaks more directly to Jacob in verses 11 through 16. He sends his angel. And if somebody could read those verses 11 through 16.
Then the angel of the Lord said to me in a dream, "Jacob?" And I said, "Here I am." And he said, "Lift up now your eyes and see all that the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth." And Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, "Do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? Are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. Surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our fathers belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you." How far?
16.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so again, God speaks directly to him through his angel. Now, I'll let you know, there are some commentators that believe that this angel of the Lord that is often mentioned in the Old Testament is potentially not necessarily an actual angel as we might think of it, as in not one of the heavenly beings that we so often see pictured shouting, "Holy, holy, holy," but may rather be a form of God. Some go so far as to say it's Jesus, and it might be, but I don't think it really matters whether it's a form of the Father or a form of Jesus or a form of the Spirit. But I tend to agree because of the way that it's worded and the things that the messages that this angel of the Lord often brings are generally much more than, for example, just good tidings or something of that nature. I believe that this is possibly an iteration of God rather than just an angel. But that's where I personally stop, that it's a possibility. I don't think we can be dogmatic that it's anything else. And it is important that we understand that the word for angel in both Greek and Hebrew literally just means messenger. There is not a specific word in either Hebrew or in Greek that means angel, like we. In fact, the term messenger, or this same word, is used of non-angelic beings repeatedly, both in the Old and the New Testament. And so, just because it says the angel of the Lord, it doesn't necessarily mean an angelic being. It could also just mean a messenger of the Lord, and it could be that God is disguising his true nature by being the messenger. Does that make sense?
But then he goes and says, I am the God.
That's another thing, is the way that he speaks in these instances is often much more authoritative than you would think of someone who was simply sent. So, again, I give credence there, but we also, again, can't be dogmatic about it. Just putting it out there for you.
So what is the Greek word?
Angelos. It's one of those words where we've turned it into an English word, but the term angelos just means messenger. I don't know what the Hebrew word is off the top of my head because I don't speak Hebrew. I don't really speak either, but I've studied it much more.
And it's a RG on Angelos.
Angelos. It's in English letters it would be ALLOS. In Greek, that double L gives us that G sound. Kind of like how the double L in Spanish gives you a Y sound. There is a G letter in Greek, but it actually doesn't appear in the word. They use that linguistic contraction. Okay. So they take off and they run. Of course, unbeknownst to Jacob, he didn't just take his wives and children.
And servants, maid servants, camels.
Rachel also steals from her father.
Yeah, that too.
Now Laban hears about this, hears about Jacob and his daughters and grandchildren leaving. He takes off in pursuit. But look at verse 24 of chapter 31. Can somebody read that for us?
And God has come to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said to him, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad.
All right. So a warning from God himself, right? Now the fact that he has household gods shows us that there's some idolatry. But again, kind of like with Rebecca and things, and the reason that Isaac and Rebecca sent Jacob back is they also haven't completely abandoned the worship of the one true God, nor forgotten who he is, right? So I have a little doubt in my mind that Laban understood who was talking to him, right? Because has any of his household gods ever answered? No, they haven't, right? And so he tells him, whatever you do, be very careful. Right? And so Laban continues and he catches up and accuses him of wrongdoing. I love the way that he puts this in verse 26. Laban says, what have you done, deceiving me and carrying away my daughters like captives of the sword? What has he been doing for 6 years? Funny how we do that, right? We justify our own actions, and then when somebody uses a similar tactic against us, it's, how could you? Jacob's learning this lesson, isn't he? Right? And so this is where we get the accusation, right? Okay, even if your wives and children belong to you, what about my household gods? Right? Jacob he's so unaware, and he again, I think this says how much he expects of his family already when it comes to the worship of God. Anybody know what he offered if the idols were found?
Death.
Yeah. Whoever has them dies. Of course, he doesn't know that it's Rachel. But this is, again, I think this kind of goes to at least where Jacob thought the influence he was having on his family was. Right? Because again, he's already acknowledged, he's talking fairly openly with his wives. Look at what God has given us, in spite of what your father has been trying to do. Right? He is seemingly getting it and is finally becoming the man that is the reason that we often refer to Yahweh as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? And so Laban searches and well, Leah's got more tricks, right? So instead of leaving him in her tent, she stashes them in her saddle and then sits on them, claiming that she can't get up because it is her womanly time.
That's Rachel.
Rachel. What did I say?
You said that.
I said Leah. I am sorry.
That's okay.
So Rachel does this trick. And of course, Laban can't find anything, right? And then for the first time, Jacob speaks, I wouldn't say harshly, but certainly more aggressively than we've had any record. Basically saying, how dare you? You have changed my wages. Yes, I have gained wealth, but so have you, right? He even points to the fact that not one time during his 20 years of service did any of Laban's animals miscarry. That's huge. So again, every single time one of Laban's female animals became pregnant, they bore at least one child that survived. I promise you that on any large or small scale farm, that's way above average. Right? So again, Jacob is pointing out the fact that yes, God has blessed me and made me rich, but you aren't doing so bad yourself because of my time. And he says, and he speaks to this also. I point out verse 40. He says, "I was there in the heat of day and the frost of night, and I slept was I was out there constantly." And this kind of goes back to him making the comment to his wives, right? That I have not held back my labor, right? It's not as though he was serving Laban half-heartedly. He was doing the job. And look at verse 42, just because I kind of mentioned this. He says, "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been, and the fear of Isaac had not been for me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed." So again, he's still referencing God as the God of my, right? And he's saying the fear of his father, the fear of Isaac. So apparently, this would seem to indicate that Isaac is still alive, right? I only point this out because the Bible is not always purely chronological. And so by making this statement, he's saying, my father is still alive, and if I send word to him, essentially what he's saying is, you don't have the army to fight my father. And he says, "And God has seen my affliction, and he rendered judgment last night." So he also points to the fact here that God is the one who told me to leave. This was not simply Jacob waking up one morning and saying, "You know what? Your dad's out in the field. Let's go." Right? And so they make a covenant. They set up a stone and they set it up as a pillar, and this is another one of those things that is very common in this time. And in fact, this is a curse that becomes a part of later the law of Moses. Of course, the law that the original readers of this book would be living under. There was actually a curse in the law for anyone who would move a standing stone or a property marker or things, but this is the standing stones that they're talking about. These were, and I think about this, these were things that still existed after 400 years of slavery. these standing stones and things. So here they make this covenant of Mitzpah, and this is another one of those things that is God kind of giving them another thing. You're going to walk past this stone. You're going to go to Mitzpah, and you're going to see this standing stone, and know that that standing stone is, if it wasn't there, you wouldn't exist. That's kind of a neat thing, isn't it? The history of your family, because of course, all of the tribes came from this family, right? I think that would, I mean, I still think it's neat when I drive by the house that my grandfather grew up in over in Medford, and I've never even known him to live there. I've just been told, oh yeah, that's the house that great grandpa used to own, and that's where grandpa lived. Neat. I mean, it's sadly not in very good condition, but it's still there, right? You know, and that's only, 60-year history. This is literally hundreds. And here, again, remember, this is, Joseph at this point is only 6 years old. All of these children are probably still in their teens. And then hundreds of years later, their descendants get to walk past this and go, so this is where great, grandpa made the agreement and started our nation. That's cool.
Do you think
Right.
there was some marking, I'll say, whatever? Did they engrave something on it? Did they stick something on it? Did they do anything? Or was it just a pile that got passed down that was the spot?
It's very possible both. Now, these types of standing stones weren't necessarily sacred, but they would have been something that was well known. Hey, don't mess with that. That's, even if it wasn't the Israelites specifically living there, this practice of these standing stones and things. Well, matter of fact, the song that we sang, "Here I Raise My Ebenezer," means stone of help. It's another one of those standing stones. So again, it was kind of a common practice, and so they would see these standing stones, and people would know, oh, that's this. This is a commemoration, and kind of in the same way that today we might put up a statue or a monument, it was the same thing, and there was at least a level of respect not to tear it down, because it was a way that well, it'd be like going to somebody else's house and tearing up the deed to their house.
So maybe just by sheer right of what it looked like, you would know that it was somebody's pile of rocks. You might not have known whose.
Yeah.
But somebody's.
It was, obvious. It's one of those things where it would definitely be deliberate enough. For example, the Ebenezer is when they cross the Jordan into the Promised Land. Joshua takes 12 stones from the river, and again, he arranges those 12 stones in such a way, and it's going to be very obvious. These were stacked here. This isn't a natural thing, and it's not big enough to be a wall. So obvious, this has got to be a monument, a standing stone. And both terms are used. In fact, there's references here in verses 46 and 48 and others, for example, to a heap. So it's not even necessarily just one great big stone stood up on its end, but there's a heap to it.
But it says they ate on the heap.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if that was like a table, or they actually denote that they sat.
Well, it says they ate there by the heap,
Oh, okay.
not all.
So New American Standard Bible.
And it's, again, that's another one of those preposition words that has 8 different meanings. So take your pick. And whether they ate on it or near it, again, it's the idea is that here we are sealing this covenant with a meal in the shadow of this, so we cannot forget what this is for, right? and they also offer sacrifice. They worship together, and I think that's also important. And I find it interesting because, again, we often refer to this time as the patriarchal time, right? And the term, of course, patriarchal means fathers, but it's Jacob who offers the sacrifice. Is Jacob the father in this situation? He is a father, but we generally refer to it as the patriarchal because the oldest male, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, right? But I think here this is a deference by by Laban to recognize that his son-in-law has a leg up on him, at least in this, in this interaction. And so here they are, and then he returns. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes, so we'll talk a little bit about the return to Esau. I'm going to specifically avoid talking about the wrestling match tonight, because that's going to take some unpacking.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. What happened to the sons of Laban and all this? We don't have anything recorded, right?
Not really. We have that one mention where they're complaining, but ultimately I think that either the respect of their father or maybe the fear of God, or both, right? That if their father says, this is good, we're done, then apparently they listened.
Yeah, because the reason I asked, it's sort of like they didn't get it ahead of time.
Mhm.
They didn't figure it out and say, look, this guy's prospered. There's something special about him. He's got God's approval. We shouldn't, sort of like you mentioned Gamaliel the other day. Gamaliel saying in the New Testament time period, if this is approved of God, you can't do anything against it.
Yeah.
And they didn't come to that realization on their own. Laban struggled against it, but he finally came to that realization, both because God spoke directly to him, but also Jacob proved it to him. But I'm just curious that nothing's mentioned that the sons finally, why didn't we see this? Why didn't we understand?
Well, of course, we're only getting one part of it, but it also seems like through some years, preferred Jacob, maybe his own son.
Well,
He certainly preferred the prosperity.
yeah.
Now, I think it is important to note as well, though. I didn't mention it. We read the verse, but I didn't comment on it. But if we go back to chapter 31 and verse 24, it says God came to Laban the Syrian. New American says Aramaean. That's just another term for Syrians. And it is important for us to understand that Syrians and Assyrians, which they kind of populated a ever-changing border between each other, neither one of those nations were ever exactly super friendly to Israel. And so it could be not unlike Esau and the Edomites that harbored some ill will, and down through the ages it didn't get better, because the Syrians, especially in the time of the Judges, the Syrians were one of the nations that God uses along with the Philistines and others to sometimes humble his people. And they also then, before the Assyrians finally captured the northern kingdom, the Syrians were also kind of always testing that northern border.
But the other one that's interesting to me, and you talked about this some before too, no one sort of turns to Rachel and Leah and say, what do you all think?
Yeah.
And, or they didn't come to their brothers and say, grab them by the lapel and say, don't you understand what's going on here? Or anything along that line.
Yeah, yeah, you're right, Steve. The women and the children are kind of just along for the ride one way or the other, right? And it's just kind of the way that it worked back then. But yeah, if Laban had, I have a hard time believing that at this point, especially after God had promised Jacob that he would be safe, I have a hard time believing that Laban would have been able to carry out any act of harm. But yeah, if something was to happen to Jacob, the daughters would have just been expected to go back home, children in tow.
Well, and when he catches up with them, he said, "These are my daughters.
Yeah.
These are my children.
Yeah.
This is my stuff."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I find it interesting in chapter 27 when Jacob, with the help of Rebecca, and then Jacob following, it says that Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see. So they sent Jacob away, and he served, at least 14 years.
20. He served 20.
So, if Isaac was still alive, that's 20 years later, from when he was old and couldn't see.
Yeah, he probably kind of a rough 20 years for him. But yeah, it's again, I only go back, and again, I don't believe that all of the Old Testament, and I don't necessarily even believe that all of the book of Genesis is 100% linear. That is, I think that God sometimes kind of skips ahead and then tracks a little bit, kind of like in movies when they do the meanwhile and they, do the fade to, hey, this was going on at the same time. The Bible does that. So I don't think we should ever just always assume that the events of, say, chapter 33 always directly follow on the heels of the events of chapter 32. Because there's often that kind of back and forth time jumps in the Bible.
You do have in verse 27 or 35, it says Jacob came home to his father Isaac and Mamre,
Yeah.
To bury him, which is after.
Yeah. I also go back to
He was 180 years old.
Yeah, and I also go back to the fact that, again, Jacob tried to put the fear of Isaac into his father-in-law, right? Because undoubtedly, as wealthy as Jacob may have become, he knew what he left behind, right? He knew how wealthy, between what his grandfather had blessed his father with in addition to that, he knew where his father stood, right? Remember, Abraham was able to go to war with 4 kings and win. Yeah. and take away spoils of war. Again, Abraham's household was a mighty household. And Isaac would have only added to that. And so, again, when he says, the fear of Isaac, basically what he's saying is that I think the only reason you haven't tried to kill me is because if my father got word that I died, you'd have to answer.
Let me ask one other question.
Yeah.
Is this event a precursor to the fleeing from Egypt?
Is this a precursor to the fleeing of Egypt?
Has some similarities.
It does have a lot of similarities, and I wouldn't say no. I mean, I can't think of anywhere explicitly where that something like that is stated. Where God says, "Oh, remember the flight of our father Jacob," and we're on our own flight now. But it certainly, as this people had to make a flight, and they're probably struggling. We know that they were struggling with some identity crises in the wilderness, right? Even telling Moses, "Let's go back." I would have little doubt in a story like this of God being with Jacob and seeing him through this flight and helping him to prosper during and after this type of situation. I don't doubt that it was a reason that God included all these details in this, right? Because when you think about 20 years, aside from the birth of the children and this event, there's really nothing else said about the 20 years of Jacob's life with Laban.
But they were sort of like slaves there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and Jacob makes reference, right? I was out there in the sun. I was out there in the cold. I couldn't sleep, but I tended your flocks. So yeah, I think that there are definite similarities, and I certainly don't see any problem drawing some of those conclusions and lines. Like I said, I just don't know anywhere in the Old or New Testament where it's ever stated this equals that.
What's really sad is Laban's his uncle.
Yeah, yeah. This is
What a lovely uncle.
well, and Steve kind of pointed it out earlier. With the daughters and the grandchildren, he's still just treating them like property. It's really kind of a sad thing, and would hope that somebody who has that kind of closer connection to Abraham and his family, and I guess the sad thing is this is a family that has connection to Abraham and his family, and this is a family that's probably, and that Isaac and Rebekah chose because it was better than what was there in Canaan. So what does that tell you about Canaan? If he gets this treatment with the choice family.
Well, and what's sad too is when he says all that you see is, he already made that deal with Jacob, that you can take this and this. But then he's saying these daughters, these children they bore, everything here is mine.
Yep.
And what about the deal you made?
And
Yeah.
then Jacob even mentioned too about his honesty would be, would come into play later on, and it did.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You were talking about it, their honesty. They never got any type of gain through being dishonest.
Not specifically in this instance and things,
Right.
But yeah, it's again, God is definitely, and I would even say with Laban, right? He was trying to use positive reinforcement because Laban understood where the blessings were coming from, right? He knew it wasn't just because Jacob was a really good shepherd, right? That he never had a miscarriage in his flocks. He knew that there was something else going on. But unfortunately, the message didn't translate, so to speak, in the same way. So, all right. We got a little bit of a late start, so I guess we made up for it on the end. Have a volunteer for closing prayer. Thank you, Thomas.
We thank you, Father, for the blessings that we have and for this time that we've been able to spend together. We ask that you be with our many ones in need of your healing hand. Be with us as we go forth from this place, that we may be a light to those about us. Forgive us, Father, when we do wrong. Help us to do